Olá, boa tarde a todos. Todos bem? Oi, Isa, Lu, mais um encontro do Tiaços. Hoje a gente vai ter. Cadê o Michael? Será que ele já está aí? Olá, Michael! A gente vai ter a alegria de receber Michael Vannoy Adams. Michael foi um dos primeiros convidados do teatro, se eu não me engano, ele foi o nosso segundo convidado. E como nós estamos em fase de celebração dos 100 encontros do Tiaços, nada mais justo, nada mais afetuoso e afetivamente carinhoso do que convidar o Michael para voltar aqui, quase 3 anos depois, pós-pandemia, dar a sua impressão, como é que está o mundo, como é que está a vida, como é que está a psicologia junguiana. Primeira vez que o Michael esteve aqui, ele falou sobre a questão das cavernas e a introversão. Hoje o Michael vai falar das prospectivas para o mundo junguiano, para a psicologia junguiana. Vamos ver o que o nosso Michael tem a nos dizer. Quero primeiro apresentar o Michael na maneira como ele, de maneira muito singular, mandou para a gente a sua apresentação. Então vamos lá, Michael. Uh, Michael Vannoy Adams é psicanalista junguiano que adora imagens e imaginação. Ele é autor de 4 livros: Imaginação Multicultural, quer dizer, Inconsciente Mitológico, desculpa, Inconsciente Mitológico, Imaginação Multicultural, tá? Belíssima capa desse livro, Princípio da Fantasia, Psicanálise da Imaginação e Pelo Amor da Imaginação, Aplicações Interdisciplinares de Psicanálise Junguiana. Então, são 4 livros do Michael, que estava escrevendo um romance também, depois eu vou perguntar para ele se o romance está sendo escrito. Michael é marido de Una Chowdhury, que é reitora do Departamento de Humanidades da Universidade de Nova York, professora colegiada de Inglês, Drama e Estudos Ambientais e membro do coletivo de artistas e ativistas Dear Climate. Michael é pai de Nat Adams, que é um estilista elegante e sob medida para o bairro francês de New Orleans. O Nat é autor de livros I'm a Dandy, O Retorno dos Homens Elegantes, e de Todos Nós Somos Dandy, Homens Elegantes em Torno do Mundo. O Michael também é feliz companheiro de uma gatinha chamada Yosa. É isso, Michael? Yosa? Imagino que seja essa pronúncia. Yosa. Michael, prazer te rever. Sempre uma alegria. Sempre lembro do nosso... Sylvester também está aqui, que eu vi, né? Olá, Sylvester. Sempre lembro... Sylvester que teve no Tiaços também ano passado. Sempre lembro do nosso jantar em Nova York, nós 3, com a Una, o meu pequeno Miguelito na época. Então, é uma alegria imensa te rever, meu amigo. Espero que você esteja bem e sinta-se completamente à vontade. A casa do Tiaços é uma casa que também é sua. Fique à vontade. Obrigado pela tua presença. Saudades tuas.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to see all of you. Thank you especially my dear friend Marcos and Luciana and Isa. It's a pleasure to be back with you, and it's an honor to be doing the 100th Zoom presentation of Theosos, which I translate as Dionysian revels, and to share in the imagination with you all. And I would love to be in Brazil with you, but I'm happy to be in New York with you. And I hope we have a nice time today and a lot of fun.
Agora você não pode instalar assim, você vai ter que.
Mas não tava lá.
Não, então vamos ver aqui, ó.
Oh, okay. The word prospects in my title is an homage to what Jung calls the prospective function. When we were designing the poster for this event, Isa first had perspectivas. And I then said, well, what about prospectivas? And she said in Portuguese, they're synonyms, but in English, they're not. And the perspective is could be any vista or any way of look, a viewpoint, but prospective is the viewpoint toward the future. So there's only one place in Jung's works that he talks about the prospective function. I'm surprised because it's a very important idea. My friend Milton Maltz, who is in the Jungian analyst, he's with us today. And he looked this up, and it's not even in the index to Jung's collected works. So it's very puzzling that such an important concept would be mentioned only once. It's talked about in a very sophisticated way by Jung, but I'm not sure it's all so well known. But the prospective function, a Freudian analysis, is backward looking to the past. It's retrospective. You could say the Freudians have the retrospective function. The Jungians are forward looking toward the future, and they have the prospective function. Jung is very careful to say that the prospective function is not a prophetic function. It does not foretell the future. He's quite scientific about this. He defines the prospective function as a probabilistic function. He says that the prospective function is an anticipatory combination of probabilities. That's what Jung says. And so today I'll be talking about prospects for the future of Jungian psychology. This presentation is not a polemic. It's not a diatribe. It's not a harangue. It's not a peroration. It's not a rant. It's an invitation to imagination about the prospects for the future of Jungian psychology. Originally, I thought I would speak on 8 topics, but that was too ambitious, and there's not enough time. So there will only be 6 topics. But I will mention the 2 topics that I won't be speaking about. One of them is active imagination and dialogue. And of course, this is extremely important because, as Jung says, the ability to do active imagination and have a dialogue between the ego and the unconscious is, he uses the word, the touchstone for the ability to have a dialogue in the external world between self and other. So if you can do active imagination in the interior dialogue, then you can do an exterior dialogue with your fellow human beings. The other topic is even more important as far as I'm concerned, and that's free association, free speech, and free expression. I believe that this is indispensable to the practice of any form of psychoanalysis, and we have a problem with that these days. Freud talked about the return of the repressed, but now we have the return of censorship and cancellation and various other forms of silencing people. And I don't think psychoanalysis can really exist unless we have the ability to talk freely about things. So I will not be talking about those 2 topics. There'll be 6 others. Maybe at some other point we can talk about active imagination and dialogue and free association, free speech, and free expression. The 6 topics today are: 1, archetypes and archetype identification; 2, complexes and complex indulgence; 3, the hero myth and the victim myth. 4, the trauma narrative. 5, amplification and mythology. And the 6th, the compensatory unconscious. So the first topic, archetypes and archetype identification. It's ironical that today, if you were to mention the word archetype, the first thing that would come to people's mind would not be Carl Jung or James Hillman, would be Meghan Markle with her podcast Archetypes. Meghan Markle doesn't seem to know the difference between a stereotype and an archetype. And her ideas of archetypes are the bimbo and the bitch. What interests me is the individual and the collective dimensions of archetypes. And for example, it's very important or interesting if you're a psychoanalyst to ask what archetypes a person is individually identified with, or in the old language, what demons a person is individually possessed by. And I'll give an example. The archetype of responsibility. One can be responsible to a fault, just as one may be generous to a fault. You can be a responsibility extremist. So I'll give you an example from a dream from many years ago. The dreamer was a woman, and she had a sister. And in the dream, the dreamer and her younger sister are shopping together at a famous department store. I believe it was Neiman Marcus. They go to pay for items they've selected. At the checkout counter, the sister suddenly notices another item. Spontaneously, eagerly, she reaches for it. Immediately, the dreamer, the older sister, reprimands her, "Don't be irresponsible." The dreamer, the older sister, is so identified with the archetype of responsibility that she cannot imagine anyone making an impulse buy, making a purchase for no good reason, just say for fun and purely for the pleasure principle. She buys only bargains or necessities, practical or sensible items, preferably on sale. Another example, a man, a significant operative in an organization that exists to champion an eminently good cause. In fact, in this instance, a cause so worthy that it enjoys almost universal esteem. If he were to take even a day from work, much less a holiday or a vacation, if he were to take any time off for relaxation, rest or fun, or for any other reason, it would be irresponsible. As an alternative, he makes himself sick. He contrives a vindication that circumstances beyond his control have eliminated any choice in the matter. He is not well and shirking. He is ill and convalescing. In order to give himself a convenient excuse not to work constantly for the good cause, he gives himself excruciating, debilitating, incapacitating physical pain. The man is so identified with the archetype of responsibility that he bodily disables himself in order to preserve his precious reputation. So that's an example of archetype identification on the individual level. Now I want to give an example of archetype identification on the collective level. It's interesting what archetypes people are collectively identified with at a particular moment in time or period of history. A contemporary example would be the archetype of justice or social justice. But let's go back to 1559, about 4.5 centuries ago, to the artist Peter Bruegel the Elder. In 1559, he did 14 drawings, pen and ink drawings, 7 virtues and 7 vices, or the 7 deadly sins. One of the virtues was of justice, of Justitia, the Roman goddess of justice. In her right hand, she has a sword. In her left hand, she has the scales. And across her eyes, she has a blindfold. In the drawing are Justitia and 300 men. In the 21st century, social justice to progressive activists is an unequivocally positive aspiration. There's no shadow to it. It's an unambiguous good. But in the 16th century, for Bruegel, the artist, justice in his drawing is provocatively ambiguous, grotesquely ironic, casually brutal, and callously banal. In this drawing, there are scenes within the scene that illustrate the disparity between theory and practice, between the ideal and the real. They show in graphic detail just how punitively cruel and unusual justice can be. I'll tell you what's in the picture aside from the image of Justitia herself in front. On the right-hand side of the front is a man lying on his back, stretched on a rack, and choked with water forcibly funneled down his throat. This is what we call waterboarding. Behind him is a man kneeling and praying while waiting for his head to be cut off with a sword. Behind him is a man tied to a post and whipped. Behind him is a man waiting for his hand to be sliced off with a knife and mallet. Behind him is a man hogtied, hoisted in the air, and dangling upside down. Behind him is a man burned alive at the stake. Behind him are men hanging from the gallows. And of course, last but not least, predictably, a man crucified. Now, when we look at these things, we see the difference between a simplistic conception of an archetype versus a complex rendition of an archetype by a master artist. Bruegel does justice to justice with a vengeance. So my question would be, as we go forward, one of the possible tasks of Jungian analysis would be to observe and monitor which archetypes people at different times are collectively identified and how fanatically they are identified with these archetypes, and whether they see these archetypes in a very simplistic way or whether they do justice to the archetypes by looking at them in a highly complex way. Now, the second topic, complexes and complex indulgence. An archetype is an idea, a complex is a value. When an idea becomes a value, an archetype becomes a complex. A complex is an archetype that a person happens to be especially, perhaps excessively, sensitive about. Now, I'll tell you a little story, a little anecdote about an experience I had many years ago at the C.G. Jung Foundation in New York. I was teaching in their public education program. It was a 5-week course, an introduction to basic concepts of Jungian psychology. And one of those concepts was the word association experiment. And one evening I administered a 50-word abbreviated version of the 100-word word association test. Afterwards, I asked the people, the adults in the audience, I asked them if anyone wanted to volunteer anything about how they had experienced the word association test. One woman volunteered, and she told us that she had associated to all 50 different stimulus words one and the same response word. 50 different words, and for all 50 different words, this one and the same response. Can you guess what that word was? I mean, think about it. Money, sex. What would be the most popular word that one might associate with everything in the world? We know what Freud would answer. This woman answered mother. This was an example of a psychotic perseveration. She could not get off the topic of mother. It was a mother complex of ginormous magnitude. I was really quite scared. I thought I might have induced a psychotic reaction in this woman by giving a pedagogical example of the word association test. This is a complex that one might be legitimately concerned about. It's not something to encourage, that you would see the world through only one particular lens. These days, the Jungians are the only psychoanalysts who actually use the word complex. I've had Freudian analysts laugh when I have used the word complex in their presence. But the phenomenon of the complex is pervasive in contemporary culture, especially with the current anxiety tantamount to a collective phobia, especially among the enthusiasts of Generation Z or Z, to avoid or prevent any situation that can include a trigger that could disturb any person. So what I want to call complex indulgence would be doing something radically different than our approach has been to complexes before. The idea before is that we would try to understand our complex, analyze it, work on it, and diminish the effect of the complex, okay? Instead of indulging the complex or affirming the complex. Complex indulgence deprives the person of an opportunity to rectify or even diminish a serious debility, all in the service of the value of universal positivity. To indulge a complex is not to analyze it, but to affirm it. It is to do exactly as the lyrics to the famous Johnny Mercer song say, and I'm not going to sing it, but you all know it: accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, latch on to the affirmative. The current notion is to countenance the avoidance of any situation that might trigger a complex to even the least discomfort of any person. The strategy is to warn anyone and everyone in advance about anything and everything that might possibly trigger them. For a 50-minute hour, the psychoanalytic office, with the assurance of privacy, confidentiality, and neutrality, was the original safe space. But it was never the intention to replicate those conditions in any other place to protect any person with an especially sensitive complex from any slings and arrows, however outrageously unfortunate they might be. The objective was to analyze intrepidly the complex so that the person could then cope more capably with what I might call the complexities of everyday life. So my third topic, the hero myth and the victim myth. Traditionally, the master narrative of psychoanalysis has been the hero myth. Think of Joseph Campbell and his book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. There were 6 components to the hero myth: the hero, the villain, the victim, the monster, the treasure, and the weapon. In the chivalric model, you had the white knight, the black knight, the damsel in distress, the dragon, the hoard of gold, and the sword. Examples would be Saint Michael with his sword standing on the dragon, or Saint George on his horse with a lance. Another example would be Captain Ahab in Moby Dick, who has a harpoon to try to kill the whale, or what Jung calls the whale dragon. In 1972, there was a very interesting essay published by a woman named Joanna Russ. Joanna Russ was a science fiction novelist, a literary critic, and a feminist scholar. This was an essay that is one of my very favorite of all time. In it, she asked the question, what can a heroine do? That was the title of the essay. What can a heroine do? And she did a little, it's almost a scientific experiment that she conducted in role reversal. She took 8 stories that had a male hero, and she eliminated the male hero and plugged in a female hero into all 8 to see what the effect would be. Some of them were funny, some of them were strange, et cetera, et cetera. The answer to her question, what can a heroine do, was apparently not much, not what a hero could do. An exception might be Joan of Arc, or a mother like the one I had the opportunity to experience personally, and the privilege. For Jessie Smith Adams on the farm in Texas, in intimate contact with wild as well as tame animals, the monster was a snake and the weapon a hoe. When she would encounter a snake, venomous fangs or not, she would chop the head off with a hoe and coil the body into a gallon glass jar. She would then invite friends, ladies to the house for coffee and gossip, seat them prim and proper, and with a flourish, flaunt the corpse and shock the shriek out of them. Now, instead of the question, what can a heroine do, we seem to have what I think is even a more radical question. The question would be, does a man, or any woman, or anyone at all, have any desire anymore to be a hero? Does the hero myth or a heroine myth have any future? Now we have the celebrity, the expert, the influencer. Now it's not the feminist aspiration of equal heroic opportunity for women. Now it's a resolute effort to replace the hero myth with a victim myth. It is suddenly much more prestigious to be a victim than it is to be a hero, whether a man or a woman. The mythic protagonist is now the victim. The victim of what? Well, of circumstance. Imagine a book with the title, The Victim with 1,000 Faces. What is going to happen with the attributes that have traditionally defined heroism? I mean, such qualities as courage, determination, fortitude, tenacity, and resilience. My question is about the future of the hero myth in terms of the victim myth, and the question about the glorification of the victim and the performance of victimhood as a lifestyle. So now my fourth topic is the trauma narrative. And I'd like to talk about the indispensability of trauma. What would psychoanalysis do without trauma? Could psychoanalysis even exist without trauma? Trauma is a shibboleth not only in psychoanalytic theory, but also in contemporary culture, especially in the proliferation of mental illness and mental health propaganda. In the psychiatric pharmaceutical industrial complex, trauma is lucrative. It is big business. It is big bucks. Trauma is a prime example of a phenomenon that generates profits from the entrepreneurial proliferation of disorders, diagnoses, and therapies, among them drugs, as with any cartel, to brand and market and, of course, sell. So I'd like to talk a little bit first about individual trauma. Trauma is not a simple phenomenon. It is not an event but an experience of an event. And we have lots of questions about the ontological status or the reality of trauma. Whether the account of the experience of the event is true, false, fictional, or fantastic is irrelevant, for any of those, Jung says, can be equally traumatic. That's a radical statement by Carl Jung. Whether the account of the event is true, false, fictional, or fantastic is irrelevant because they can all be equally traumatic. Now we have post-traumatic disorder, or PTSD. Trauma is now for some people an identity, in fact, a permanent identity. For such individuals, trauma is who they are. Why would they be eager to relinquish or transcend that identity, the one and only identity that they happen to possess? If trauma is such an elemental story, a narrative so essential to identity, why would any individual risk a psychoanalytic process that, as James Hillman says, re-stories life? Why have a comic, happy narrative when you have a sad, tragic, traumatic, and dramatic narrative? So that's the question about individual trauma. Now let's think about collective trauma. Individual trauma, the trauma of a person, is a serious enough phenomenon. But what of collective trauma, the trauma of a people? A provocative exercise in mass psychology is to juxtapose collective atrocities, compare and contrast the similarities and differences, and evaluate the relative orders of magnitude. In such an appraisal, which collective atrocity, for example, the transatlantic slave trade or the Holocaust, is more atrocious? 12.5 million Africans enslaved, or 5 million Jews, or 6 million Jews exterminated? And then we also have the notion of the transgenerational transmission of trauma. The contention that not only the immediate victims of such atrocities as the transatlantic slave trade or the Holocaust directly suffer trauma, but that successive generations or descendants of the survivors of those atrocities also suffer trauma. There are 5 questions. What is the precise process by which a collective trauma is presumed to be transmitted from one generation to another? Over how many generations is it possible for a collective trauma to be transmitted? In the absence of a deliberate effort to sustain and prolong it, does a collective trauma eventually tend spontaneously to dissipate and ultimately expire? What are the functions of remembering and forgetting, including repressing, in whether or not collective trauma is transmitted from one generation to another? Finally, in spite of noble intentions, does the sheer rhetoric of the transgenerational transmission of trauma ever inadvertently and paradoxically invent a trauma when none exists and impose it on a generation that, if it were simply left well enough alone, might never suffer collective trauma? In the literature of everyday life, the trauma narrative may now be the most popular genre. Contemporary culture is not so much totalitarian as traumatarian. The 5th topic, amplification and mythology. One of the most important Jungian methods is amplification. Amplification is a comparative, contrastive method to process images from the unconscious. One of the sources that Jungian psychology has employed for the purpose of amplification is mythology. Most often, either Jewish and Christian mythology or Greek and Roman mythology. These are, of course, the mythologies of the two traditions that Matthew Arnold famously identifies as the distinctive, constitutive foundations of Western civilization, the Hebraic tradition and the Hellenic tradition. Mythology was one of the processors prominently available to both Freud and Jung in Europe in the 19th century. In Germany, I put that in quotation marks, in Germany so-called, in this case, in Austria and in Switzerland, Freud and Jung both had gymnasium educations that under the rubric classics included Greco-Roman mythology. Although Freud was Jewish and Jung was Christian, both were equally conversant in Judeo-Christian mythology. In the Hellenic and Hebraic traditions, for example, is Homer's Odyssey and Moses' Exodus that eloquently recount the journeys, respectively, of a person and of a people. Even the words Odyssey and Exodus have entered the language as idiomatically generic for distinctive styles of journey. The one myth is an individual journey from war to wife and son. The other myth is a collective journey from mud and straw to milk and honey. By amplification, the myth of a chosen and enslaved people and a promised land has served historically as the most influential template for liberation from oppression. A century ago, I imagined that multiculturalism would supersede racism. I imagined that the promise of multiculturalism would mandate the immediate addition of mythologies from multiple cultures, that a supremacist conceit prevalent in Western civilization for the previous 500 years, the age of discovery and conquest, of colonialism and imperialism, had relegated to the very periphery of esteem. What I envisaged as the most probable eventuality was a splendidly additive expansion of access to a myriad of mythologies, all and sundry suddenly available for the purpose of amplification. That scenario now appears naively problematic to me. I am unsure that amplification by mythology has much of a future. One problem is the insular protectionism against cultural appropriation, not exactly multicultural exchange. Another problem is the decline, not only in the classics, but also in the humanities. If Freud and Jung were to attend an American university today, they would incur onerous debt to pay exorbitant tuition, and they would earn a degree in the 3 A's, Adderall, Ambien, and AI. How are those who have not had the singular privilege of significant exposure to the humanities, to the cultural sensibility and the cultural literacy of a truly liberal education, with mythology as an essential element of the curriculum, how are they to process images from the unconscious with sufficient ingenuity and nuance? If the members of Generation Z, as well as the members of all generations post-alphabet, are ignorant of the Hellenic and Hebraic traditions, of Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian mythology, as well as the global panoply of multicultural mythology, then how will they have any appreciation of, interest in, or use for amplification? Now that there is chatbot, Perhaps there will be a custom algorithm for Jungian psychology. Should I trademark, commodify, and monetize MythAmp? The sixth and last topic is the compensatory unconscious. The unconscious is one word, but there are two radically different definitions of unconscious. There's the repressive unconscious of Freud, and there's the compensatory unconscious of Jung. Everybody has heard of repression. Nobody except Jungians has heard of compensation. In the Freudian unconscious, what has been repressed can only be expressed if it is censored or disguised, that is, encrypted. The Freudian unconscious is opaque. The Jungian unconscious is transparent. For Freud, the unconscious is a secret code to be cracked. For Jung, the unconscious is just a foreign language to be learned. Freud needs an enigma machine and Alan Turing. Jung needs only Berlitz. In contrast to Freud, Jung places the onus squarely on the analyst. Any failure of comprehension is entirely the fault of the analyst, who is not fluent in the native language of the unconscious. The menu that the garçon at the Left Bank Cafe presents to diners who happen to speak only English is not a chauvinistic prank or a protectionist plot by the Académie Française to frustrate or obstruct an order of beefsteak avec pommes frites. The menu is not cryptic, it is French. In contrast to Freud, Jung believes that the purpose of the unconscious is not to conceal, but to reveal. The Jungian unconscious is a compensatory unconscious. What Jung calls the compensatory function of the unconscious may be the most important concept in Jungian psychology, even the most important Jungian contribution to psychoanalysis. The compensatory unconscious presents alternative perspectives on the attitudes of the ego. It is entirely at the discretion of the ego to take or leave the alternative perspectives that the unconscious offers for consideration. The unconscious attempts to compensate attitudes of the ego that are partial, prejudicial, or defective. Spontaneously, autonomously, and purposively, the unconscious contacts and impacts the ego in an effort to transform and expand consciousness. I cite the Monica Lewinsky scandal to illustrate the compensatory function of the unconscious. A charismatic, perpetually concupiscent politician assumes that a position of supreme authority entitles him to a flirty intern with a taut thong. He demonstrates that although sometimes a cigar is not a penis but just a cigar, sometimes it is a dildo. He parses the word sex out of existence and patently commits perjury in a pathetic attempt to frustrate political opponents eager to impeach him. The Jungian theory of the compensatory function of the unconscious predicts that the dreams of President Bill Clinton will be prudishly puritanical, while the dreams of Special Counsel Ken Starr will be pruriently pornographic. In the cases of both Clinton and Starr, the incongruity between the ego and the unconscious is so extreme that the compensation is not just different, but opposite. How does the compensatory function of the unconscious actually operate? The unconscious vigilantly monitors the performance of the ego and issues continual, critically constructive commentary on it. For example, in the demonstrably routine nocturnal punctuation of sleep by dreams. This process entails the presentation of alternative perspectives in an attempt to compensate an ineffectual, inadequate, or problematic attitude of the ego. The compensatory unconscious is an evolutionary capacity alertly on notice to rectify any attitudinal error or exaggeration that the ego might commit. In this endeavor, the unconscious proposes various potentially valuable options for the ego to consider, assess, and then accept, reject, or address in some other manner. The compensatory unconscious is not a divine intervention. It is more a devilish advocacy. The unconscious does not utter wisdom. It merely presents alternative perspectives for consideration by the ego. Now, superego psychology and what I call psychomoralysis. One aspect that initially interested me and especially appealed to me was the description of psychoanalysis as non-active, non-directive. I am personally neither an activist nor a directivist. I am simply an analyst. In contrast to other psychotherapies, which presume to know in advance, always already, what was good for any person, psychoanalysis eschewed platitudinous normative notions and instead directly consulted the unconscious, quite specifically of the particular person in analysis. That seems to me to be no longer the case. Almost all varieties of psychoanalysis on the contemporary scene seem to me to be in imminent jeopardy of a radical deterioration into what I call superego psychology. What I mean is that many, if not most analysts, now presume to know what is moral for the person in analysis. And with a conflation of innocence and insolence, believe that such an opinion entitles them to inflict a moralistic doctrine on the vulnerable customer who ironically pays a rather hefty fee for the privilege of such condescension. These presumptuous impostors are practitioners not of psychoanalysis, but of what I sarcastically call psychomoralysis. They do not analyze, they moralize, and they excuse this conduct with the best of intentions and with a surety tantamount to a grandiosity. Of course, they do not regard what they do as moral. They prefer the ideologically correct euphemisms, social or political. These psychomoralists intervene between the ego and the unconscious and usurp the unique role of the unconscious. Among the interventions are disclosure, advice, reassurance, and affirmation. By such gratuitously intrusive, active, directive interventions, they subvert the very purpose of psychoanalysis, which is to encourage the person in analysis to, quote, consult the oracle. That is, to consult the unconscious in order to ponder directly the riddle that the unconscious poses to the ego, to contemplate properly the critically constructive commentary, what Jung means by compensation, that the unconscious attempts to communicate to the ego, about the ego, for the ego. Honestly, I swear, I'm not cynical. I promise. I admit that I admire the fundamental principle of cynicism, which is eudaimonia, psychical clarity, or what I like to believe would be the equivalent of psychoanalytic consciousness. The Greek word kynikos means dog-like. One prominent Jungian analyst once told me that he wanted to be the top dog. He told me that I was, in contrast, the dog that walks alone. Well, that sounds a lot like Diogenes the cynic. However, anyone who knows me knows that I like cats. I'm not dog-like, I'm cat-like. The perfect proof is my new kitty, Yowza. You can't teach an old dog new tricks, but you can't teach a cat any tricks. I like it like that. So I don't have a cynical attitude. I'm not a curmudgeon. I don't want to be a grumpy old man, nor do I want to be a wise old man. In fact, I don't want to be an old man, period. But I am, and I do wonder and worry whether what I love, and that includes Jungian psychology, will have a life that lasts very long. Instead of memories, dreams, reflections, I've emphasized theories, themes, projections. By projections, I do not mean, in this instance, pathologically defensive, specious ascriptions of characteristics to a person who possesses no such traits intrinsically. Rather, I mean estimates of future possibilities as extrapolations from present trends, which is what, in the title of this presentation, I mean by prospects for the future of Jungian psychology, and what I believe Jung means when he defines the prospective function as an anticipatory combination of probabilities. With that, I wish us all well.
Excelente, Michael. Excelente. Diretrizes para uma psicologia junguiana do futuro. Bom, vamos abrir para as perguntas. Tá? Quem quiser fazer pergunta, por favor, coloque o nome no chat, eu chamo e a pessoa faz a pergunta direto para o Michael. Os convidados do Michael, Silvestre, Michael, Jenks, se vocês quiserem também participar, por favor, fiquem à vontade, ok? Queria começar, com aqui no Brasil, um livro chamado A Crítica da Vítima, que é de uma filósofa italiana, não sei.
Não, está falhando para todo mundo, sim.
Podemos voltar? Podemos voltar, Isa? Vamos lá. Vamos tentar de novo, Isa? Tá. Onde é que você estava? Onde é que a gente parou? Tá, vou começar de novo.
Recomece.
Tá, vou começar de novo. Tem um livro publicado no Brasil recentemente chamado A Crítica da Vítima, de uma filósofa italiana chamada Daniele Giglioli. E ela fala que a vítima é o herói do nosso tempo, muito semelhante a algo que você trouxe hoje. Ela fala que a sociedade se dividiu, mas queria te fazer uma pergunta. Como esse lugar chamado vítima, lugar que a gente poderia pensar como, num primeiro momento, psicológico, talvez até mesmo sociológico, como essa noção de vítima tornou-se uma identidade psicológica nos nossos tempos? Né? Como foi que a vítima se tornou um personagem psíquico? Eu queria saber como é que você pensa isso na cultura, né? E como é que você pensa isso também, se você vê isso também na sua prática clínica? A vítima é uma nova figura arquetípica, é um novo personagem psíquico extremamente valorizado nos dias atuais?
Yes, can you hear me? All right. Well, that's a big question. I don't have an immediate answer for it, but I believe it's a real phenomenon. One could imagine the monster with 1,000 faces, or the villain with 1,000 faces, or you could imagine all sorts of things with 1,000 faces. One could imagine one of these characters in the drama, or the characters in the story at a certain moment in time becoming more popular and more prominent than another for certain cultural reasons. Obviously, something is going on in our time that's a little different than something from 100 years ago. And some of it has to do with shifting demographics and democracy, and different groups having more access to power. And it also has to do with new media. I'm assuming that the new media, the way Marshall McLuhan talked about things, new media make new things possible. You know, McLuhan wrote a book, From Archetype to Cliche. I'm not sure whether there's a movement from archetype to cliche, or whether archetypes are actually just cliches themselves. It's just a synonym. But you know, I don't think that there's anything that I'm not sure that Jungian analysis has a political activist kind of role to play in fixing the world. I don't know that it's equipped to do that. I believe it's good at doing one thing potentially, and that would be to analyze forms of consciousness. And then the other people in the culture can try to apply it in whatever way they see fit democratically, and let all sorts of people with different opinions express themselves in that process. And then let's have a vote or something like that. And then let's have another election in a few years. And so, you know, I'm not particularly worried about something becoming permanent, but it seems to me that there is some kind of change that has occurred here, a change of emphasis, and certain kinds of values, some of those that I mentioned, like resilience or tenacity, or some of these values are being questioned these days. I was with somebody last night at a reception for the University of Sussex, where I did my doctorate, and it was a reception in Manhattan, and there was a psychologist there. And the University of Sussex, where I did my doctorate, has a program in the psychology of kindness. You see, it would be interesting to think of a hero who specializes in kindness, you see, but that kindness is not exactly, you know, as James Hillman said, the traditional Western hero either is trying to slay the dragon, it's to kill the dragon, it's to kill something. So, I mean, if you're defining heroism that way, that's not the way Gandhi is defined. His weapon is not a sword or a gun or some other kind of thing like that. His weapon is passive resistance, satyagrahi, and Odysseus's weapon is his wits. It's not his muscle. So there are various kinds of things that one might do to be a hero or to do something important. Maybe some people believe that they can actually be heroic best be heroic by being a victim. By assuming that role, they could actually get something they want, and that victimhood is in fact their weapon. You see, there are other people who believe that I don't know, I mean, the villain myth is also quite popular. You know, I mean, you can think of various politicians who people characterize as being complete villains. You know, they don't see them as heroes; they see them as villains. And so it's an interesting landscape. I'm just interested in whether, since the hero myth has been such an important story in Jungian psychology, and something else seems to be popular these days, I'm just wondering what the mix of things will be going forward.
Só para ilustrar, Michael, aqui no Brasil, a gente tem uma frase que é quase uma espécie de ditado, que é: a vítima tem sempre razão. Alguns anos atrás, um filósofo brasileiro chamado Francisco Bosco escreveu um livro cujo título é A Vítima Tem Sempre Razão? Interrogação. E ele utiliza muito uma escritora americana, Laura Knitz, que escreveu o Contra-Amor, que ela estuda esses problemas de assédio em universidades americanas, e o livro foi muito mal recebido no Brasil, porque ele problematizava exatamente essa questão da vítima. Então, me parece que tem alguma coisa mesmo sendo pensada na consciência coletiva sobre essa questão. Acho que tem a ver com o que você está falando. Luciana, com você, por favor.
Michael, super obrigada pela sua palestra perturbadora. Eu queria trazer um novo tópico aqui para as prospecções, que é os sonhos. São sonhos. Quando eu li o título da sua palestra, Prospecções em Psicologia Junguiana, eu lembrei de um livro que eu li há um tempo atrás de um neurocientista brasileiro que se chama Siddhartha Ribeiro, onde ele usa esse termo, prospecção, mas ele usa o prospecção, eu até anotei aqui o pedaço que ele usa, ele fala que o sonho é um momento privilegiado para prospectar o inconsciente. E aí ele problematiza no livro o sonho no mundo contemporâneo, né? Ele fala, então, que com a ansiedade que a gente vive, com a correria, com a pressa, os sonhos podem estar num momento crítico, né? As pessoas ou não lembram dos sonhos, ou pelos remédios que tomam, os ansiolíticos não sonham, né? E a preocupação dele é que isso possa ser uma coisa muito, muito ruim coletivamente e individualmente, né? Assim, para a própria individuação da pessoa, ele não usa esse termo porque ele não é um junguiano, mas é para a individuação da pessoa e para um crescimento coletivo, né? Então, ele dá exemplo de vários momentos da civilização em que o sonho foi muito útil na construção e no desenvolvimento, né? E ele diz que a capacidade de imaginar, inclusive, pode ser bloqueada quando o sonho não é exercitado, né? Então, a capacidade de imaginar na vigília morre quando a capacidade de imaginar no sonho fica bloqueada. Eu queria saber a sua opinião sobre isso, sobre os sonhos e essa prospecção na psicologia junguiana.
Prospect is a very interesting word, because in some way, when you say prospect the unconscious, I think of what we call, you may too call it too, the prospector. The prospector is the person who goes and tries to dig gold out of the ground, or he's a miner. He prospects in that way. He's looking for valuable metals in the ground. So there's that sort of thing too, where someone would dig into the unconscious, or in that other word, the subconscious, one would dig down into something. So that's one other meaning of the thing. But I think you really mean something again about the future here. And Jung doesn't seem to believe that that most dreams are really telling you something about something that's beyond the foreseeable future, like the short term. I believe when he's talking about, he's got the two functions of the dreams. One, the main one he talks about is the compensatory function of the unconscious in dreams. But he says that sometimes there's a prospective function that comes into the dreams that really gives you a much clearer and more definite idea of what you ought to do in the future. It gives you some kind of guidance, sort of the way Hermes does, or Mercury as the psychopomp, who is going to guide you to some other place. And so, but he doesn't think that that's what most dreams do. It's only a few dreams occasionally that do that under extreme conditions. Most of the dreams are really telling you ways you might do something different with your current or present situation. Okay, so you know, in the Bible and some other things, there are all of these questions about I don't know. Caesar's wife Calpurnia has a dream and says, "Don't go to the Senate, honey, because you're going to be killed." Or there's some, or Joseph listens to the Pharaoh's dreams and says, we need to store the wheat because there's going to be a famine and everyone's going to starve if we don't. So there are these ideas that there's a revelatory or a prophetic function somehow. In Islam, there's a whole idea of the Gabriel or some other kind of angel or something coming to Muhammad and giving something about the future that you now are supposed to go tell other people about. So there's that whole dimension of things, but I don't believe myself that I don't see any evidence of it in my own work with people, that people are having what Jung would call big dreams about I don't know, the future of America or something like that. I just don't see it happening. They're ordinarily very important, very personal, intimately valuable kinds of dreams, more or less about their immediate present or their foreseeable future. And so one can always, you know, use the word dream in two different ways. One is a literal dream, and the other is like Martin Luther King Jr. with "I have a dream." And that gets us over into using it as almost as a synonym for imagination on one level. Even the word imagination, I mean, on one level, we've got the adjective imaginal, which James Hillman made popular and other people, imaginal. But then we've also got imaginary, which is a kind of a negative adjective. It's just imaginary. It's not real. And then we've got the imaginative, as if it's creative. You know, imaginal is neutral. That's what one of the things I like about it. It doesn't assume that it's a merely imaginary thing or always an imaginative thing. It sort of lets us not worry about that and just look at the images and see what they're actually doing. So I guess I'm not, I don't see that the unconscious is projecting something dramatic and large into the future, like a revelation for the entire culture or the world. I don't see that happening myself. I'm not sure that's exactly what this Hibedo, is that what you said his name was? I'm not sure that's what you meant by that, but I do believe that people who are like me, they're always on their you know, their handy cell phone, their device. You know, they're always looking something up on the internet or some other kind of thing. Then they're not paying attention to their dreams. They're not linking up to the unconscious. they are not thinking about the imagination the way people interested in theosos are presumably interested in the imagination. I mean, I love the idea that this is, you know, the workshop for shared imagination. You know, I like sharing in that way. It's not the collective imagination where everybody has to imagine the same thing. It seems like it's an effort where people have different kinds of imaginings and they share them with each other and they wonder about how the other person imagines it versus how they imagine things. I think that's a beautiful activity. And it's very different from just looking up something on Wikipedia or, you know, I mean, I do those things too, but, and then we've got my dear friend Nilton Maltz on here who could talk to you all day long about, we laugh about AI or artificial intelligence all the time because we don't think it's intelligent at all. It's just an algorithm. It's just a mathematical formula that prospects for data. It collects large amounts of data and then comes up with some kind of average. I mean, I'm not the kind of scientist that Nilton is. I'm just a psychoanalytic scientist, okay? He's that and other kinds of scientists as well. You know, I don't even know the lower math versus the higher math. I'm just as dumb as Carl Jung was in that regard. I can barely add, but Nilton, you know, knows calculus and all of these other kinds of things. And so he actually, I listen to him, you know, I respect him, I believe him. And when he says that we don't have anything to really, the only thing we have to worry about is that these things take over and they're so dumb, they're so dumb that they ruin everything. But it's not something that has a soul or a psyche or a heart or a genius or something like that. It's some other kind of activity. And intelligence is, you know, we're giving them too much credit to even use that word, I believe. That would be my understanding of it. But, you know, to have some artificial imagination, it really would be artificial. It's an artifice. It's synthetic. It's not the real thing. The dreams are a part, we dream as some kind of outcome of thousands of years of evolution. You know, it's a magnificent mystery that we have the unconscious and that it does the kinds of things that Jung is talking about. It's just terrible that more psychologists and more psychoanalysts really are illiterate in the Jungian theory and methods. They don't know what we're talking about when we use these concepts. Again, one of the examples is if you use the word unconscious, they don't understand it in the same way you do at all. You know, they imagine, of course, they think that, you know, you must be using it exactly the way they do. But I tried to articulate a little bit of the really significant differences between the Jungian idea of the unconscious and the Freudian idea. They're radically different. The Freudian unconscious is really about desires and drives and wishes, or drives, desires, and wishes. It's not really about ideas. You know, they don't think that the unconscious actually thinks or imagines. They don't think it's a mind of its own in the psyche. You know, they think it's impulses or something like that need to be expressed because, you know, you're sexually repressed or something like that. You know, they don't see that it might be the source of some important imagining that you need to take into consideration. They don't think that the unconscious is intelligent in any way. I don't think it's some sort of wisdom or truth. I think it offers opinions to us that we can, you know, take or leave, you know. So.
Ótimo, obrigada.
Obrigado, Lu. Sônia, contigo, por favor.
Boa tarde, muito obrigado por sua excelente palestra. Só para acrescentar alguma coisa sobre a palavra prospecção e prospectiva, ambas existem em português, e, na realidade, com os dois sentidos mencionados, tanto a prospecção de um minério no solo, como em relação ao futuro. Então, a sua palestra poderia ter sido traduzida como prospectivas mesmo, mas, de qualquer maneira, eu elogio muito a Isa, que é uma excelente tradutora e faz um trabalho maravilhoso no Chas. E sobre sonhos, além do trabalho do Siddhartha, que a Luciana mencionou, tem um outro indígena que agora ficou muito famoso no Brasil, que é o Davi Copenaua, que escreveu um livro chamado A Queda do Céu, que foi até comparado por um junguiano famoso como o livro vermelho dos indígenas e que deveria ser lido de tão importante que é. E ele fala que os brancos, que ele chama o povo da mercadoria, não sonha, e eles, indígenas, sim. Então, só para completar e dar essa informação. Muito obrigada pela sua palestra.
Obrigado, Sônia. Martinha, quer falar, Martinha, por favor?
Thank you very much. I could just say there is this organization, you may know, the International Association for the Study of Dreams, and there used to be people in it. Barbara Tedlock was one person. There were people there who spent a great deal of time in Latin America and particularly in Mexico. And she edited a book on dreams from different cultures. And her husband, Dennis Tedlock, translated the Mayan Codex, the Popol Vuh. And so they were very, very interested in the processes of imagination and of dreaming among indigenous people, especially in pre-Columbian, the pre-Columbian Americas. And it's very interesting to think of the different ways the word dream, or whatever the word is. I mean, vision, reverie, imagination. There's so many different words with different feelings to them in all these different languages. And I'm very happy that you told me about the two meanings of prospect in Portuguese. And anyway, I thank you again.
Obrigado, Michael. Obrigado, Sônia. Martinha, contigo.
Primeiro, obrigada pela palestra, eu achei fantástica. E já uma questão, eu gostaria muito que tivesse tido tempo para os dois últimos temas, né, que você disse que, quem sabe, fica na próxima. Né? Estou aqui bastante curiosa e torcendo para uma nova palestra. Né? Mas eu queria só voltar um pouquinho àquilo que você estava falando, né, do arquétipo, né, do herói, e aí falou da vítima, mas eu estava pensando uma questão, né, se tudo não é, na verdade, assim, se a gente não pode pensar nisso em termos de diálogo, né, porque eu acho que eles estão todos muito entrelaçados, né, o herói, a vítima, o vilão, né, porque o herói parte para salvar vítima de um vilão. Então, acho que são aspectos, né, que a gente pode pensar assim, de uma mesma história. Né? Então, onde um sobressai, né, onde é que estão os outros? Né? Então, se a vítima está sobressaindo, né, onde está o vilão, onde está o herói, onde está o auxiliar? Né? Então, assim, em vez de pensar como coisas separadas, colocar esses elementos muito nesse diálogo. Né? Não sei o que você acha disso.
Well, I think that would be wonderful. I like that idea just as much as I enjoyed reading Joanna Russ's essay when I first came across it. I just was delighted when I read her piece. And I was thrilled to see what would happen. I mean, you're also talking about, I like these experiments that people would conduct, like, what if we did this with something? So I would love to, I mean, I would hope, why don't you do something with this? I mean, it would be great if you would initiate a dialogue. I mean, people do this, they rewrite fairy tales, there's been a lot going on in the last 50 years, a lot of it by feminists, rewriting fairy tales, rewriting myths, rewriting folk tales, and all of these kinds of things, switching people around. We should all be very grateful for all of the work that's been done in that way, it seems to me. It seems to me that's the way art is created, in a way, is to imagine, is to, one could just be ideological about it, but I think, to me, that's more boring than being imaginative about it. I'm appreciating myself personally, the artist who goes into the situation with an open mind and plays with the, I don't know, the 6 components of the mythic structure here. Like, what if we, instead of having a sword, we had this? Or what if the monster saved the hero? You know, what if we did something else with this? You see, I think we would have a lot of fun and find a lot of interesting things out about the psychologies. I mean, I do know people who, as children, have, I won't name any because they're present right now. I mean, they're free to speak if they want to about, their dealings with their own heroic, the summons they had to heroism, in their own background. But, people do dress up in costumes and all of this sort of thing and play this kind of role or that role. My daughter as a child, she used to love to be the princess or something, okay? But, I'm all for girls using a sword too and whatever else is available, okay? Let's have everybody try out everything. And I don't want just girls to be in distress. Heck, I'm in distress too, and I want somebody to come help me. So there seems to me plenty of room for interplay here. I don't even think dialogue or conversation is good, but interplay among the characters in the field. It doesn't even have to be a linear thing either. It doesn't have to be that kind of narrative. It could be cyclical, or it could be some other kind of display. All of that would be, it seems to me, consistent with the appeal to the imagination, So thank you for that. I'd like to hear more and see more.
Obrigada.
Tia, agora você tem um trabalho aí para apresentar, tá?
Opa, vamos ver. Prospecção.
Prospecção. Michael, queria te fazer uma pergunta. Esse teu livro, ele é de 1996 e talvez tenha sido, salvo engano, um dos primeiros livros junguianos a tratar a própria questão do racismo, né? Anos depois, você publicou um artigo que eu gosto muito, que é Jung, África e a Geopatologia da Europa. Esses dois, quer dizer, o primeiro livro e esse artigo, eles são... Qual é a relação deles com isso que você está trazendo hoje sobre a questão do trauma e da transmissão geracional, né? Porque você está fazendo uma espécie de uma crítica de uma narrativa traumática sobre esses traumas geracionais. Como é que esses são momentos diferentes de você pensando uma mesma questão? Você mudou de opinião? Queria localizar um pouco melhor o teu pensamento nesse tema, já que é um tema, também tem esse artigo teu, né, The Venus Sable, né, esse é um tema que é muito comum a você escreve bastante sobre isso. É um mesmo lugar, você fez deslocamentos, você avançou para novos territórios. Queria entender um pouco.
Routledge, my publishers, or one of my publishers, approached me 2 or 3 years ago and wondered whether I would revise the book. But from my perspective, it's not that kind of book. You wouldn't update the book. They didn't want me just to add a new chapter at the end, like further reflections on the question. They wanted me to rewrite the entire book. Well, you know, this is the publishing industry. This is the publishing industry. Pardon?
Por que eles pediram?
I have no idea. It was around the 25th. It was around the 25th anniversary. They didn't say we want to have the important 25th anniversary edition with a gold star on the cover. I mean, it was the first Jungian book to deal with race and racism and color and all of that. I'm very proud of that book. I don't get not many people write to me and tell me how thankful they are for me. But occasionally I get a letter or something from somebody, and sometimes it's about that particular book, and I'm pleased. I'm very pleased and proud to have written that book. It's very dear to my heart. I was going to write a book that I never did write and never will write, called The Imagination of Dreams. And you can't steal the title, okay? But The Imagination of Dreams. Like Freud does the interpretation of dreams, and the great Michael Vannoy Adams writes The Imagination of Dreams, and goes down in world history, okay? So that's how I laugh about, you know, my ambitions. But, you know, that book was what got written first, and it was because I have a multicultural family, and my brother and sister were adopted from Korea when I was a child, and my daughter was adopted from India. My wife is from India. My son is Indian American, and I'm just a gringo. I apologize, but I mean, I'm just, you know, no, I'm a mongrel from the British Isles. I'm, you know, English, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, or something like that. I mean, this is just a fact. You know, I do what I can with my deficiencies. I wish everybody well. I wish I had a little bit more pigment, okay, than I have, okay? So, you know, my blue eyes hurt when I go out in the sun. I feel I'm a victim. I'm a victim of my DNA, okay? And I hope you all feel sorry for me, you know, the rest of the evening. You know, that book is very important. I believe that there are things in that book that, if I may say so, people have not yet even begun to talk about. You know, I could actually say a few words about that. I don't, there's not enough time to do that in any decent way today. But when I talked about the diversity of diversity at the end of the book, and when I talked about that the next problem people would have would be something called practices as preferences. It wouldn't be because of things that it would be ethnicity and not race would be the question. And ethnicity is a cultural practice. And actually, it's not something that's material or physical, or it's not in the DNA or the genetics or anything like that. It's not nature, the way skin color is, or body shape, or some other kind of thing like that. To me, color, body shape, and all that are trivial. I mean, I like some skin tones nicer than other tones, something like that, maybe as a personal preference, but I don't, it doesn't seem to me to be a very significant category. I don't organize my world around those kinds of gross generalizations. I'm much more interested in, I love cultural differences, you know, and so those are the things that appeal to me. And I find that a much richer area to go into and investigate than these. And so I'm sort of surprised and a bit dismayed that these days the idea of race has come back and is so popular again and is used in a way. I find that maybe regressive. If I feel it regressive or reactionary, from my personal perspective, it's regressive or reactionary. And I wish there was something that was really truly progressive about that. I really don't think that's, I don't think the anti-racism and all that is the wave of the future. I think this is, I hope it's a temporary kind of thing and we can get back to something, cultural differences as something as a far more interesting thing for people to explore with their imaginations. And so that would be my hope personally. But anybody who would be interested in that topic, see, I didn't make a life out of that. There are some people who do one thing and they do only that one thing and they do that thing very well for many years. But my imagination happens to be more diverse than that. And so there were other things I wanted to think about and feel about and write about besides race and racism. But there are other things I wrote besides those two things that you did. I've got a little PDF that if anybody wants, I can send you the, in 2 seconds, the references so that somebody could try to find these writings, or I'm always quite happy to communicate with anybody and supply them with anything they might wish. But thank you for asking that question. It's very important to me.
Esse é um livro, foi o primeiro livro teu que eu li e realmente ocupa um lugar bastante importante na minha formação como junguiano. Tá? Queria deixar isso registrado aqui. Silvestre, você não quer fazer uma pergunta para o nosso amigo Michael? Já que você também é do teatro, você também já passou por aqui. Microfone fechado.
No, I love what Michael is presenting, and he's always very succinct. I cannot focus like he does, so I ramble along, but he is able to make 6 points, and, you know, and no, I was perplexed by the victim with the 1,000 faces as a kind of a prospect of the future, because, you know, the way the victims present themselves, they don't have more than 10 faces, it seems to me, that the complexity of the hero and the multicultural heroes, I mean, it seems that in every culture there's variations of the myth, and they have really many faces, but the victim does not have that kind of diversity in a way that the hero has, and maybe it's not enough had been written about the myth of the victim, so the victims have yet not diversified in a way in the culture. It's like, you know, there are few kinds of misery in my sense, that, you know, versus more kinds of the way how to conquer misery, so to speak, you know.
Yeah.
So it's you know, there seem to be a certain mythological sort of imaginings are much let's say have less of a imagination to it. They're not imaginative enough. Maybe that's another aspect, that if the hero is the kind of the, you know, the conquering that goes into new territory a lot, and that has encounters many different things, but certain other forms, like let's say the victim, it does not go far out, you know, to encounter different kinds of victimhood or something, you know. So there are limitations, I think, to a certain archetypal dimensions, or maybe limitation, I mean, that there was not enough imagination given to them to diversify them the same way, let's say, that the hero myth was. And the sort of you know, talk about trajectory in the last 100 years, that the myth of the hero was so important, you know, for Freud and Jung and the early psychoanalysts, that now, in a kind of, you know, certain aspect of things got stuck in a way in the victimhood, or even victim moving towards the trauma, that somehow, and there's not enough imagination given, because, you know, the suffering, the pain, the kind of potential, you know, trigger points when you enter that territory, stop people from imagining, in my sense, because, you know, now in my you know, hopefully in the Jungian world we can still imagine, because in academia you cannot imagine anymore, because it would be too narrowing and too many trigger warnings or potential, you know, problematic things around that when you start to you know, discuss the issues with regard to, let's say, victim suffering and so on.
Obrigado, Silvestre. Acho que são boas questões. Aguarde um convite para você voltar ao teatro para falar sobre as suas pesquisas sobre os livros negros, tá bom?
Thank you, Sylvester. How's Oklahoma?
You see it through the window.
He's sitting in Oklahoma. You know. Anyway, hope you're well.
Tá. Michael, vamos lá. Última pergunta, Michael. Quero te agradecer pela tua disponibilidade, pelo teu carinho em estar aqui conosco. Prazer imenso te rever, meu amigo. Duas perguntas. A primeira é se você está escrevendo o seu romance, que você havia dito que você tinha começado. E a segunda pergunta é se é possível ser Dante no mundo contemporâneo. Quer dizer, ser Dante pode ser uma saída de individuação para a gente?
I don't know anything about the novel.
Dandy.
Oh, Dandy. Okay. Well, okay. What was the first question? I'm sorry. I suddenly had my you invoked my Natty Adams, my son complex. Okay. Anyway, what? The first question was what? Oh,
Sobre o
well, I don't
romance.
know what you're talking about. I think you're losing your mind. There was a time in my life when I wanted to write a novel, as when I was a young man. I thought I was going to be the William Faulkner of Texas. I thought I was going to do what he had done for Mississippi and the South. I was going to do for Texas and the Southwest, but that never happened. One time I started writing a novel, and I wrote about 30,000 words, and then I decided you have to write about 150,000. So I abandoned that. So there will not be a novel, but you know, all of you are to blame. I haven't written a book, or haven't published a book since 2014. For Love of the Imagination has 2014 on the title page. It's like The Interpretation of Dreams. You know, Freud's book was published in 1899, but you know, he was not known for his humility. He was not a modest man, so he wanted to be the man who had written the first book of the new century. So he puts 1900 on the cover, even though it was published in 1899. And so Routledge, for some reason, decided to put 2014 on mine when it was actually published in 2013. That's 10 years ago. I have really not written anything since that time. What I do is, I mean, I know you have early onset now, your onset of something. I'm not quite sure whether it's Asperger's or Alzheimer's or something, okay? But I'll help you, my friend. You know, I'll visit you anytime in assisted living.
Imaginação.
But I paint now, you know. I paint image. I do visual things now. But now what you have done is you corrupted me by inviting me to do this and giving me the opportunity to think about these things. Now I'm beginning to think, well, is it possible that a man with a pacemaker and a stent and a bad heart, who's 75 years old, 3/4 of a century, is it possible that a man with a cat that is waiting to attack him at any moment, this terrible cat that's going to kill him anytime, that a man in that position could actually write a book? You know, it's we will see. I mean, maybe there's book number 5 is still out there. I've got the title Prospects for the Future of Jungian Psychology, you know, and so and then of course all of you will be writing testimonials on the back cover, okay? You'll be telling what a wonderful man I am. And then, you know, I will be thanking Theosos and Brazil and Sao Paulo and Rio and Kardec. I'll have to mention Kardec, the Kardecians. You know, psychic surgery. We'll have the entire thing in the book, and you know, why not? It'll be the most fabulous thing you've ever seen. And so the dandy. My son is a dandy. He was voted Dandy of the Year one time. He's written these 2 books. I Am Dandy, the Return of the Elegant Gentleman, and We Are Dandy, the Elegant Gentleman Around the World. And he makes bespoke suits. That means custom suits in New Orleans. He can measure you over the internet. You will be poor. Your retirement funds will be drained because he charges a lot of money for these special suits, but you look beautiful in them. He makes suits for women as well as men, and every other gender that there could possibly be. So he just got married, or had his wedding celebration in New Orleans a month ago, and everybody there looked fabulous. So his name is Natty Adams, Nathaniel Adams, but Natty. He has a website. He has all sorts of stuff. He has an Instagram thing. If you want to see fabulous clothes, then look up Natty Adams, and see what, and if you want to save the planet from global warming, then you can go on and click on Dear Climate, which is my wife's artistic, academic, collective kind of thing to operate in that area. The cat and I will just be hiding from everybody and enjoying ourselves in private. But anyway, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, all of my dear friends in Brazil. Thank you, Isa, for translating things so beautifully and so well. Thank you, Luciana, and my dear, dear friend, Marcus. Thank you, and say please give kisses to Miguel and Pedro. And I hope to see you soon. Your beard is looking good. It's not as nice as mine, but you know, I'll help you trim it when we get together. Anyway, I love you all, and I hope to see you soon. So thank you.
Meu amigo, muito obrigado. Prazer enorme te rever. A casa é sua. Volte sempre. Fico feliz de te ver bem. Mande um grande beijo para a Una, né? Tenho muito carinho por ela. Espero que a gente possa se ver em breve.
Thank you.
Beijo em ti. Até a próxima, Michael. Obrigado.
Bye bye, friends. Thank you.
Pessoal, Silvestre.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Obrigado pela presença, pessoal. Ótimo, Michael Vannoy Adams conosco novamente, comemoração dos 100 encontros do Tiaços. Extremamente emocionado e feliz. Obrigado, gente. Nos vemos no próximo encontro. Lu, que dia é?
26 de maio, Renos Papadopoulos, Refugiados, Alteridade e Complexidades Arquetípicas.
Até lá, gente. Bom fim de semana. Bye, bye, Michael. Bye, bye.
Bye bye. Come to New York.
Okay. See you soon. See you soon.